Hey guys, it's Drew. Thank you for checking out the Sober Fix podcast, where we talk about addiction and living life sober, one day at a time. If you like what you hear, go ahead and follow us. And if you get some time, check out our Instagram page at the Sober Fix podcast, and also our YouTube and TikTok at the Sober Fix. Hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, everyone. Anyone checking in and listening? It's Drew from the Sober Fix. I am super excited today. We've got a great guest on, Robert Pardon, who has been sober since April 25th, 1986. 38 years. How you doing, Robert?
I'm fantastic. When I hear you say that, it's like, is that really true? Did I really get sober? But it's been a long freaking time. It's been a great journey. I'm doing great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I see a lot of your stuff on Instagram, and I pull inspiration from it. I enjoy, listening to it, watching to it. I've checked out your podcast. I believe you have 264 episodes.
Wow,
It's
you have
amazing,
done
man.
your homework. Yes, sir.
And I just want to start off, like, how did you get started on drinking? What's kind of the background behind all that? How did you get
You
started with
know,
substances?
and by the way, thank you for these questions you sent me. I think they're so thorough, and I think if a person addresses these things, you'll know probably more about them than you'd like. Uh, I was like a lot of people, Drew. Um, I was just curious. I was rebellious. I wanted to see what the big people were doing. As Father Martin would say, I want to do what the big people did. And so it was just experimentation. And with my dad being alcoholic, obviously there was a lot of booze available once he passed out. And so it wasn't what alcohol was. It was what alcohol did. And the short answer to your question, I started drinking when I was 14 years old, and in a summer with nothing else to do, and with some friends of mine, and thought, hell, let's pick a good tree and let's go steal some booze and let's drink.
Yeah, and that's really how it started off for me too. It was like experimenting. But it's interesting as I look back, and I'm an AA guy. I know you are too, and it's like I love in the book how they talk about how we love the effect produced by alcohol.
Yes. Yeah, that's the doctor's opinion. Roman numeral 26, I believe. Men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol.
Yeah, and it was like, I mean, I don't remember much from when I was younger, but I remember what it was like to experience that first kind of release, or whatever you want to call it, relief, release, excitement, fun, of when I take that first drink. Was it like that for you as well?
It was. I tell people oftentimes, Drew, when I speak or when I chat in a meeting, I I came from nothing. I was a nothing. But when I drank, and it was the first time I drank, instantaneously I became an almost. And when you live in the psychology of internal depression, pre-alcoholism, and you find something that takes you from being trapped as a nothing, and an almost was as good as I was ever going to get. And so I knew that early on. After the first drink, I thought, it sucks out there, but everything right now is okay. And that launched me into my drinking career. I mean, it was a freaking career. Nobody does as what I do as hard as I do it, as long as I do it, without it being a career, right?
Exactly. And so did you start to get consequences right away, or did you have a period of time where drinking was still fun and it was still kind of working for you, or were you one of those people that found consequences pretty quickly?
That's a great question. You know, when I was a freshman in high school, when I first drank, just in the summer between my eighth grade and ninth grade, and I didn't start seeing consequences till I was 18. In Japan, they have a phrase that says, first the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, then the drink takes the man. And I'll tell you, Drew, my story is pretty common. In a relatively short period of time, 4 years is not very long. I'm 70 years old. I would give anything to get 4 years back. Um, but 4 years isn't a long time. and and when you can only drink periodically, as you know, because I still had to go to school, I had activity, I was very athletic, um, played basketball and baseball, I was in choir, I was in drama, I was very preoccupied, and in between all of these things, before school and after school, I was trying to find that happy place that told me everything was okay right where I was at, because everything else was insanity. And so, in a relatively short period of time, and this is where my alcoholism really took me, in that mental obsession went hand in hand with the physical nature, what stamped in my DNA. By the time I was 18 years old, then alcohol started making decisions for me. So I took a drink between 14 and 18. The drink started to take the drink when I became 18 and an adult, and I could burn my life to the ground myself. Thank you very much. And then it progressed, maybe more rapid than others, but it was rapid enough for me to burn my life to the ground more than once.
Yeah. And did you, how long did it take you before you started to get treatment? I was listening to one of your podcasts and you actually got sober, I believe, in Vegas. Is that right?
I did. I did. My first detox was at the Nevada Treatment Center in Las Vegas back in February of 1986. So I went untreated from, you know, I started drinking when I was 14, but I became alcoholic when I could first really dedicate at about 18 years old. I was practicing up until then, finding out that it was alcohol that I really wanted and needed in my life to find that sort of balance that would keep me from blowing my brains out. And so from 18 to 32, a solid 14 years, I was, it says in the big book, we thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. And that's what I was trying to do. I was just trying to find that happy place. And then everything just caught up to me when I was 32 years old. And I was either going to get well or I was going to die. There was no middle of the road. There was no longer being an almost. That ship sailed probably when I was 24, 25. And I spent years just trying to search, just trying to feel better, just using marriages and jobs and the military, finding anything that would work, because alcohol was like breath. you know I would never ask a person not to breathe. They would say, "What are you, an idiot? I'm going to die." And that's what alcohol came to me, and I just couldn't let it go until I had to. Um, and that's what happened to me when I was 32.
When you were 32. Yeah. And so did they introduce you to AA right away? How did you find AA?
Yeah, yeah. Another great questions, by the way. Uh, I went to treatment. To make a long story short, um, I went into treatment on February 9th of 1986, and right away this detox was run by no other than alcoholics, and they were very connected to AA, and part of their service was, so I think in day 3, day 4, they took us over to a place called the Turning Point in Las Vegas, where we were first introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous, and they understood that the path to their wellness was going to be the path to my recovery as well. And so as soon as we were ambulatory, as soon as they could, make sure that we weren't going to go into seizures or pass out during a meeting, they took us to a meeting right away.
They took you right away. Yeah. I love that. It was kind of, I was introduced early on as well too. And I didn't really, when I first came in, I didn't know what I was up against. I didn't understand how powerless I really was over alcohol, how I had very little choice in the situation as an alcoholic. I was always going to go for that next drink unless I had a defense against it, and it's like,
Yeah.
how did you, at what point did you realize, like, I have to go all in on this AA thing? Like, I have to be all in on recovery.
You know, I I was really afraid that if you knew who I was and what I did and the places I went, I was afraid you wouldn't want me. And Drew, I couldn't take. No one wanted me, Drew. I'd worn out my welcome anywhere, everywhere. I got fired the previous night. My mom and dad, they would change the locks if they thought I had a key. My second marriage had crumbled. I had already walked out on my daughters. Brothers and sisters, if they knew it was me, they wouldn't even answer the phone, let alone hang up on me. I had nowhere. And I was really afraid that you wouldn't like me. And I had nowhere to go. And so honesty was really hard for me because I had such shame. So I learned all the words. I learned all the cliches, the catchphrases, and I could hear something, I could memorize it, and I could parrot it because that's what we do, right? We're getting over. We're making people think we're somebody that we're not, and we try to be all things to all people. And here I was in this room, and I heard these stories, and I thought, yeah, that's fine for you, but you don't know about me. And so I treated AA like a buffet. You ever go to a buffet, Sizzler or what have you? I want some of this. I don't want any of that. Stay away from this. I don't like beets. I don't like liver. I don't like certain things, so I don't eat them. And and I tell people that worked right up until I got drunk and I relapsed at 71 days. And just so your audience knows, relapse is not recovery. Get that out of your freaking mind right now. You can message me. We'll have a conversation about it. You can talk to Drew as well. Relapse is part of addiction. Relapse is not part of recovery. Recovery is part of recovery. If you're clean and you're sober, I'm not saying we don't have bad days. I'm just saying if you relapse, it's because you're not in recovery. I've chosen to not be in recovery anymore. I've chosen relapse. Just like if I'm driving down the street, I'm in drive. For me to go backwards, I have to slow my vehicle down, bring my vehicle to a complete stop, put it in reverse, and then I can go backward. So going backward is not going forward any more than going forward is part of going backward. They're two separate things. I must stop doing what I'd been doing that got me well, that got me recovered, that got me my sobriety, and then I may need to make an active decision to go backward, which is relapse. And that's what I did. I thought I could find an easier, softer way. It says that A, we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God couldn't do it if he were sought. I thought I could get away with things like I'd been getting away with everything before. And like I say, that worked right up until it didn't work.
Yeah, and it was the same way for me. I thought I could kind of pick and choose parts of the program, and also when you were talking, it made me think about being terminally unique, where
Yeah.
you see other people recovering and working hard, and you just think, you know what, like that's working for them, but it's just not going to work for me. Too much shame, too much guilt, like you talked about.
Yeah. And and in Las Vegas back in those days, there were probably 4 or 5 24-hour clubs. And so the club that I lived closest to, the Turning Point, had a meeting at 6:30, had a meeting at 10 a.m. Late lunch bunch was 12:30 in the afternoon. Then they had a 5:30 meeting. Then they had an 8 p.m. meeting. Then they had a 10:30 meeting. And then the Midnight Messengers was at midnight. And then there was a 3 a.m. meeting. So it wasn't like I couldn't work. I was nowhere to go. So I used to hang out. I used to live in this club. If they'd let me sleep there, I would have slept there. And I would go to meetings all the time. So you talk about 90 and 90. I blew that out of the water in the first 30 days. I was doing 90 and 30, killing it and just learning the lingo, learning everything, always in the back of my mind. You're not going to get me. You might be a sucker. You might be telling people the truth. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but you're only going to get so much from me. And and really getting back to one of the questions you asked earlier, it wasn't until I was 6 months sober coming back, and that's a great story and a miracle, my relapse and what happened. But when I came back, I was 6 months sober, and And Drew, I realized that 6 months, you know, Nietzsche said we have met the enemy and it is us. When we stare into the abyss, it stares back. And I was staring into the abyss. And I knew, Drew, that if I went back out, I would never, I would never survive. I knew enough about alcoholism and the progressive nature of the disease, and I knew how sick I was. And I went to my sponsor, Jack Fisher. He died 44 years sobriety back in 2019. He was my sponsor for 32 years.
Wow.
And I went to Jack and I said, Jack, I'm afraid, you know, what do I do? Because if I go back out, I'm going to die. And Jack didn't talk about the steps, didn't, because he knew I was working the steps. He introduced me to service. He said, Bob, I've never known anyone actively involved in service who has relapsed. And I said, what do I do? And he got me cleaning ashtrays. Back in those days, you could smoke in the rooms in Las Vegas. And I got making coffee, and I went on a 12-step call, and I went, started working central office and being very active in service. And to this day, I'd never known anyone. The key word is actively, and you're involved in service. I see you, and and all my friends who got long-term and quality sobriety, they're serving. They're in treatment centers. They're part of our 164 team. They're out doing it and being happy, joyous, and free. And that was the answer then, and it's the answer now, because the 12 steps have nothing to do with me. If they have anything to do with me, it's to admit I'm powerless, clean up my crap, go say I'm sorry, and practice the principles so I can go help somebody else. Nothing to do with me. I want a step that says, now let's talk about Robert. But it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I love that. And I was going to ask you too. So, and you kind of touched on it, but was meetings in the beginning, so your first 30, 60 days, was that what really helped you get through the most? We're going to a lot of those meetings and being surrounded around people that were starting to live
Oh,
solution.
yeah. Las Vegas AA is pretty brutal, you know. And guys are, I mean, they're dealing blackjack, they're room service waiters, they're coming from the casinos, and I tell people all the time, it's like learning how to swim in a shark tank. You either get devoured or you learn how to avoid the sharks, because there's a push pull. And I'm not saying, I think anywhere you get sober is the hardest place you can get sober at. I'm just saying that for me, there was an element in Las Vegas. They make everything attractive, you know. When I was in California drinking and using, I would drink in the toilet. I would drink, it was not very attractive. In Vegas, you could gamble, look at scantily clad women, go to a free buffet where you could throw it 3 times and eat some more, find your connection at the roulette wheel, dealing, you know, brown heroin or crystal or what have you, and you get free drinks as long as you gamble. I mean, who wouldn't want that, right?
Right?
And
Yeah.
so it just fed into every addiction, behavioral and substance wise, known to man. All the weaknesses that I possess or didn't possess. That's why they're weaknesses. And so going to meetings was almost like a refuge, and people were freaking serious. I mean, and we had a lot of East Coast people who moved out to Vegas, and these guys, they were freaking brutal. They, they, I remember sitting at a pinochle table playing pinochle with these guys, and I swore, and I said, I dropped an F bomb or something like that, and they said, you have to get away. And I said, what do you mean? We don't talk that way around here. I said, what do you mean you don't talk that way? And they called over somebody else. They said, hey, come and play because Robert's not playing now. And they said, do you need us to tell you again to get out of here? And that's the way they were. And that's the way they were. They were brutally honest because they knew if they weren't honest with me, I was going to die. And they didn't care if I liked them. They just care if I lived. They just wanted me to live. They knew I was like them. And if something didn't change, I would I would die of untreated alcoholism.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's like, and I hear the term that like if you baby the alcoholic, you'll end up burying them, you know? Like they have to be confronted with what they're really up against, the truth of how dangerous and fatal and progressive and chronic alcoholism really is, you know?
Yeah, you know, it's not like learning how to ride a bike, you know? I mean, when a child learns how to ride a bike, they ride with training wheels, they practice a little bit, and then they fall and then get back up. Many people, and you've not seen them, that person who's a chronic relapser, or they just don't get it. They think it's a them program. They never get over their selfishness, or they think AA is therapy, which it's not. And they go back out, and we never see them again. And it's sad, but it's prevalent in AA more than ever, because treatment centers, they are a two-edged coin. It's good that there's a place for people to go, but treatment centers operate differently because of funding, and it carries over. They bring in their mediocrity to meetings, and newcomers, they think I'm intolerant. They think you're intolerant because we thought, they love to say, it's my program. It's just a suggestion. Bullcrap. It's not. There's nothing. The only alternative suggestion is go get drunk. Go get drunk. If you don't want to follow these suggestions, go get drunk. Don't just do it once. Do it more than once. That's that's the reality of our disease. And it's not to say, love and tolerance is our code, but honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. And if a person, me included, isn't willing to be honest, and I'm glad you brought up the doctor's opinion, because we have to recognize that we are trapped in a progressive illness over any considerable period. Things get worse, never, an absolute word, never better. They never do. And if you can turn around and drink like a gentleman, the big book says, my hat's off to you. Heaven knows we have tried long enough and hard enough. That's what it says. And for this alcoholic, you know, have another drink, is like picking up a 9mm with a 152 grain round, blowing my brains out, and wondering why I'm dead.
Yeah, and one of the biggest points that I reached in recovery sobriety was when I realized, really internalized the fact that alcoholism is progressive. Like because I heard that for a long time. And it wasn't until I finally was really trying to get sober and I was going to meetings, and this was early on, and I had relapsed, and it just got worse. It was like everyone said it's going to be, and when I actually finally realized, look, I am up against alcoholism, and it's just never going to get any better for me. Like nothing is going to make it to where I could drink and enjoy it like I did that first year. Did you reach a point where you just realized, oh my gosh, like it really is progressive. Like it's never going to get better.
Yes. And that was in my relapse. I relapsed April 19th of 1986. And fortunately for me, I was out 6, 7 days. Uh, and I relapsed, and I was staying at this place called the Rhett Butler Motel. And if you're familiar with Las Vegas, it was on the corner of 15th and Fremont. And the bar that was catty corner was the Sundowner Saloon and Sundowner Lounge. And I took my last drink there in a bar. And it was kind of interesting in that the bartender, there was a shift change, and I ordered a scotch on the rocks. I'd like to tell you it was top shelf, but it was probably bottom shelf back in those days. And I was holed up in my hotel room, going back and forth across the bar, and I'd ordered a scotch on the rocks with a beer back. And the bartender who turned around was a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Oh,
And
wow.
I was embarrassed. He recognized me, and I recognized him. And he said, if you're lucky, there will be tomorrow. And I took that drink, and I went back to my hotel room, and I tried to recapture that feeling of being an almost. And Drew, you've heard it before, and many of your listeners have heard it before, it's not that we wanted to die. We just didn't know how to live. And I went back to that hotel room and I drank and I drank and I drank. And I tried to become an almost. And I couldn't. That was gone. Being an almost was gone. And I knew that the only logical place for me to go in a moment of clarity was back to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that was April 25th. That was the next day. I drank until I passed out, and I got up the courage and I went back to the rooms of AA, and I've never left, Drew.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you too, like at 38 years now, and our, the big book talks about how quickly we forget how bad it was out there when we were drinking. How do you remember that now at 38 years? How do you remember just how bad it was and make sure that you stay on your recovery path?
I think that's a question every old timer needs to answer, uh, because it's a dual-edged sword. It says we don't regret the past, nor do we wish to shut the door on it. That's in the Promises, pages 83 and 84. I stay very active. I go into treatment centers. Uh, I stay active in meetings. My friend Jason and I, we've got this First 164 group, and we have 15 volunteers, and we oversee about 15 meetings a week. I'm very involved. I listen to speaker tapes. I do steps 10, 11, and 12 every single day. I take sponsees through the steps. Um, and I'm not an idiot. I just got back from my dermatologist. Why? Because I had melanoma cancer. And so I go to a regular checkup twice a year. I get checked up. I go to my doctor, on a regular basis. I get blood work done because I want to make sure I stay in shape. I want to make sure I'm healthy. And step 10 really does that. Step 10, um, steps 1 through 3 are involved in the surrender, which get me to step 4 through 9, which is the plan of recovery. Steps 10, 11, and 12 are the continuation of that recovery. And so step 10 has incorporated steps 4 through 9. My sponsor, who's been sober 44 years, slow willed, happy, grateful, recovered alcoholic. God, I hated that phrase when I first heard him say it. Um, he says, if we clear away the wreckage of our present, which is step 10, it doesn't become the wreckage of our past. So it says, continue to take a personal inventory, and when I'm wrong, promptly admit it. Not if you're wrong, but when you're wrong. And I was in the restaurant business for a long time. I'd never known sobriety not being around alcohol in Las Vegas and my subsequent career. And I remember that I need to take my vitamins every day. I have a high blood pressure medication. I would never not take that because I know if I don't take it, I could get high blood pressure and a stroke and all bad, everything will go downhill after that. And I take Eliquest because I have a irregular heartbeat, right? And so I take those every single day. Why? Because I have a condition that when not taken, bad things can happen. And the same way with AA. I have a terminal illness and an ego that is out to kill me. And if I don't take my medicine every day, I wouldn't be the first person at 38 years, at 40 years, that thought, oh, maybe, I've been sober long enough. Maybe I can have a drink. You know, what are you, an idiot? I'm still powerless over alcohol. Nothing will ever change that. So what I recover from, as you know, I've introduced myself as a recovered alcoholic. I recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And it's a mental obsession. And it says the very same person who seemed doomed, who had so many problems he resolved of ever solving any of them, now finds himself easily able to control his desire for alcohol. The only requirement necessary is to follow a few simple rules. I follow the rules.
Yeah, and I loved how you answered that as well. And it's like I can relate so much to everything you're saying. And also, it's like a lot of people believe that like once they put the drink down, like, oh, I've put the alcohol down, like I'm good to go. Could you kind of like explain that, like Like, what would you say to those people that think that, like, oh, I just put the alcohol down, like I am good to go now? Could you just kind of explain how they still have alcoholism?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not everyone who has a problem with alcohol is an alcoholic. I have siblings who learned how to drink before they crossed that line. Maybe the DNA didn't affect them the same way, which is really weird because we shared the same mom and the same dad, the same upside down household. Um, but they can drink successfully. I'm not one of them. So if a person can do the right about face, and this was a big problem. I have a degree in alcohol and drug studies and counseling. I've worked in various modalities of treatment, and at one time I was a DUI counselor in California. And the hardest job I've ever had was working with DUIs, because these are periodic people. They don't want to make the connection between their DUI and their drinking. They're in denial. And so some people, can measure it. And what's great, and to the core of your question, if it was about alcohol, I would only need step one. I admitted I was powerless over alcohol, that my life had become unmanageable. Good. Got that out of the way. Just learn how to control my drinking, stop being an idiot, and everything's going to be okay. No, that's not enough for a guy like me, or a person like you, or many in your audience. I need step two. I need to believe that my life as it relates to alcohol is insane. I mean, who would drink? Who would drink after we're confronted with the insanity of our drinking career? And then turning my will and if you have all power, why are you turning your will and your life over to the care of God? So steps 2 through 12, or steps 2 through 9 especially, are involved in a life transformation. I need to become a different person who doesn't need alcohol to tell them that everything is okay. Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense. And when did you like notice your life really transforming? Like you got sober in Vegas. When did you start to go like, wow, this recovery stuff is really helping me?
You know, I, it's really been in spurts. There's been plateaus, and where I could just see the progress that was being made through me as a result of my higher power. Um, I think, okay, I was I was having lunch with a guy named Texas Mike, Scott Shields, and his girlfriend Melissa at a Denny's in Las Vegas, and this was after my relapse. And Texas Mike was like this seer. I mean, this guy was just freaky. He didn't look like he knew anything, but he knew everything, and he rarely said a word. He just listened and nod, and the only thing was missing was a wizard hat. And we were at lunch, and we were talking about my relapse and about my coming back and things that occurred and things I was seeing differently. And Mike said, "How many days did you have before you went out?" And I said, 71. And Mike said, as if he knew, I think he did know. And he said, how many days do you have today? And I said, 72. And he looked at me and he said, see, I knew you could do it. And that was transformational for me, Drew. I saw AA working. It was the first time that I'd accomplished anything worthwhile. I went one day longer than I had previously gone. And that was all I needed. And then there were milestones along the way. When I got my year chip, my dad was there. My dad was sober by this time, but not through AA. And it was the only meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous he'd ever gone to. And I used to wonder why my dad never came to my baseball games or my basketball games. And the one time he showed up, my dad showed up, was to give me my 1 year chip. So that was a milestone. I thought, man, I can do this. And just little by little, things would happen in my life. And then my dad died August 1st, 1988. Today's the anniversary of my dad's death 36 years later. And my dad was the first real loss that I had experienced in sobriety. And I went to God and I said, God, if you get me through this crisis. It was the first day of my vacation. I'd driven from Southern California, Las Vegas. I knocked at my dad's door and he died 15 minutes before I got there. I was a junior. Don't lose the irony here. I'm signing the death certificate for my dad, who was named Robert Pardon, and I'm signing Robert Pardon. That was kind of weird. And
Wow.
and I called up my sponsor, Jack, and I said, and Jack knew my dad. They were good friends. And I said, Jack, my dad died. What am I going to do? And God really showed me how he wanted to do for me what I couldn't do for myself. Here I am in Vegas. My dad's dying. My dad's dead. And I'm feeling alone because my dad and we were now friends. We spent 2.5 years becoming buddies. And losing my dad was a big deal in many ways. And I realized that God could do this. There's not anything that God can't walk me through. And there were other things in my life that it just continued to show me. So there hasn't been one thing. There's been a series of things where God has demonstrated to me. Sometimes it's in the life of someone else. Sometimes I'm working with a newcomer and you see that light go on. You know what I'm talking about. You're in a treatment center, you're walking somebody through the steps, and all of a sudden they think, I don't have to live this way anymore. I can surrender. Or remember the first time you took someone through step 5 and they're like a new
Yeah.
person? And you get to relive that experience of them finding freedom that you found. And it's things like that that over time just build and build and build. I'm so convinced I may be a snob because you can't argue with me. I know what works and I know what doesn't work. And I know what being an untreated alcoholic is like, and I know what being a treated alcoholic is like, and I'll be a treated alcoholic any day of the week.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that story. That was powerful. I wanted to ask you too about like the higher power. How was your connection with the higher power? How has that kind of evolved? Was that something that you found easy in the beginning, or did you have to work at it? How did that kind of play out?
That was, by the way, another great question. Um, I used to go to church, Covina Baptist Church in Covina, California, and it was at the height of my crystal meth usage. And I was drinking, and I was in this phase. It was back in 78, 79 when I realized that remorse didn't have to be what everyone thought. Because if I could just snort my way through my remorse, I wouldn't have to go to sleep. But every 4 days, I wouldn't have to wake up every day and feel like a piece of crap, right? You remember those days, and so I remember being so high, and I'm in choir in church as a professing Christian, when I'm trying to not nod out as the pastor preaches because we're still in the choir loft, and I'm so freaking high, and I can't wait to go get drunk. It's 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and I'm wasted in the choir, you know? I mean, that's how I was. And so I was very performance based. But I was very tangible as well. We're very tangible people. If we can't smell it, see it, touch it, taste it, you know, experience it, we don't think it's real. And so when I came into the rooms, I didn't know who God was, but I knew what God looked like. God looked like Jack. God looked like Will. God looked like Esther. God looked like Tom. God looked just like Buddy. And he probably was Eddie's twin. And he looked a lot like Russian Ted or Pete the Greek. And these men and women, I saw God in them. And they wouldn't lie to me. They would say, Robert, let us show you this way. Max, my sponsor, Steve Matthews, giants who are still either died, recovered, or they're still trudging the road of happy destiny. These were the men and women who introduced me to a higher power because I could see them, I could hug them, I could hear them. And if you sat close enough, you could smell them. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. And little by little, as I began to trust them, I moved away and started developing my own relationship with a God who I could not see, could every now and then hear, but always was convinced that God was acting in my life. And I'm a Christian. I believe very specifically and doctrinally, but I'm so glad that AA has the principle of a power greater than yourself. I'm so glad on page 12 in Bill's story, he talks about the experience that he had. He couldn't relate to a creator of the universe, but it says that when he believed that all he had to believe, a concept, a power greater than himself, but paraphrasing here, it says it took him from the icy intellectual shadows in whose shade he shivered, something like that, and he stood in the sunlight at last. And that's what just believing. I tell people nowadays, Drew, I don't care who your higher power is. I just want to know what your higher power does. That's what's important to me. Because if your higher power isn't giving you freedom, if your higher power is not allowing you to be happy, joyous, and free, if your higher power is not offering you an avenue to true sobriety and recovered, then you're not reading the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, because step 3 says, uh, became willing to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood God, not as you understood God, because my understanding is a little bit twisted. But if I understood how the first 100, what they believed, what Bill believed, what Bob believed, what Clarence believed, what the early people who wrote that big book, what they believed, then I tap into a power that can do for me what I can't do for myself. God is not a God is not a doorknob. Screw that. That's ego. God is not a coffee cup, because a doorknob has no purpose until I turn it. A coffee cup doesn't have a purpose or a status until I fill it up and I pick it up. Notice the word I. So God is excluded from those things. God is a sunset. I used to have a friend. He said, "My name is Jim. I'm a lucky alcoholic. The tide goes in and the tide goes out, and I don't get drunk in between." Guess what his higher power was? It was the tide. Some people's higher power is the sunset, sunrise. They see God in the ponderosa, the redwoods, and that's awesome, because that is certainly more powerful than they could ever be. Redwoods live for hundreds of years. We start decaying at about 80, 85, 90.
Yeah, that's really cool. I too love how it's a power grade in ourselves, and it's open to us figuring out. And I love how you talked about it's what the higher power can do.
Yeah. Yeah, because we can't exclude anyone. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. So whether you're atheist, agnostic, Jew, Christian, Muslim, Seventh-day Adventist, it doesn't really matter. I don't care. It shouldn't matter. I just don't want you to die of a treatable. We have a treatable disease. Could you imagine if no one ever died from cancer anymore because all forms of cancer were treatable? We suffer from a treatable condition.
And what do you think? Like, you've worked as a counselor, and you've worked with a lot of around people that, like you mentioned, that had DUIs and different consequences from alcohol. Why do you think some people are just so resistant to a recovery program in AA? Is it the denial? Is it the higher power thing? What do you think that really is? Are they just resistant to change?
I think all of the above. I think you've got your finger on the pulse of why people don't get well. Um, in the 12 and 12, which Bill wrote published in 1953 or 1954, which is a commentary on the big book on the 12 steps. He says, when he talks about the 7 deadly sins, he says it's not surprisingly that pride has the list. Well, pride will keep me from anything. Pride will tell me I shouldn't listen to you. Pride will tell me, Drew doesn't know crap. Listen to yourself. Whereas we have to surrender. We have to surrender to our illness. We have to surrender to our condition that we can't change. And in step 1 of the 12 and 12, it starts out, who likes to admit complete humiliation? Practically no one. So they told me, they said, I got good news and bad news. I said, what's the bad news? And they said, well, I said, what's the good news? And they said, you only have to change one thing. And I said, well, what could be the bad news? And they said, that's everything. Everything. I have to be willing, Drew, to allow everything out on the table. I have to surrender. Surrender doesn't mean that I'm holding a weapon waiting for you to turn your back so I can shoot you. Surrender is a means of laying down all forms of defense and holding up my hands and say, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. And the ego prevents that. Yet I listen to Joe and Charlie a lot and other speakers. And I'm not sure if it was Wayne Dyer who said it, but I really appreciate this, that the main activity of a person's ego, which tells me I'm right, the main activity of a person's ego is to convince me it doesn't exist. That is so funny. I love it because that's my ego. Oh, don't listen to them. They don't know what they're talking about. You're right. They're wrong.
It's crazy too, because like I would go into like detox, and I would be in so much pain, hurt, anguish, just beaten down. And I go in there for about 7 days and I start to feel a little bit better. And when I go in there, I am desperate for change. I'm like, I'm going to go to meetings, I'm going to do all this stuff. And it's crazy how 2 weeks later, for me, a lot of times, my ego is already telling me like, oh, like you overreacted, like you could do this on your own, or.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
and that's where understanding the disease model really comes into handy. We're trapped in a progressive illness over any considerable period. That's why I never sponsor anyone who can't tell me why they're an addict, why they're an alcoholic, why they're a drug addict. Tell me from a medical standpoint why you can't use again. Because until you're medically convinced you can't use anymore, you'll never be mentally convinced. It's like a programmer who writes code. You know what they put in? They put in a back door. They put in a back door as a way to escape. And that's why we need complete surrender. That is why we need to be done. I need to say, I can't do this anymore. I've given up. I've surrendered everything that I am and everything I have. And again, I think, sadly, some people are statistics, and that's sad to watch someone die of untreated addiction. Um, but they continue using, you know, and some deaths come in different ways. Some people overdose. Some people die in a car accident. Some people commit suicide when they're not using because they can't, it says in the big book, you can't imagine your life with or without alcohol. You're at a jumping out place. You're not comfortable anywhere. You're not comfortable not drinking. One of the saddest things, and Bob Darrell talks about a lot in his talks, and coming from Las Vegas, I understand it. One of the friends he mentions was a friend of mine I went to treatment with. Her name was Carolyn, and her nickname was Bright Eyes. She committed suicide, blew her brains out at 17 years sobriety. because she could no longer imagine her life without alcohol. And she knew she could never drink again. Sad. So people in all stages, that is why we just need to stay active. We need to serve others. We need to see others get well. That's the only chance we have, because, my personal recovery, as it says in Tradition 1, um, is dependent upon AA unity. For our common purpose, our common welfare should come first. Personal, Robert Pardon's recovery, depends upon you and I being united in a common cause. And the best thing that we can do for the person who's still suffering, the person who's still sick, is to help them understand that what they have is treatable and they don't have to live this way anymore. And I think that's where our obligation really comes into play. We need to show them that if they're willing, it says in the promises, if we're painstaking about this phase of our development, we will be amazed before we're halfway through. We're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. But we have to be painstaking. We can't run to the medication every time we get hurt. We have to be willing to not use, because as long as we're using, we'll never get well. But just because we're not using doesn't mean we get well. We have to set down the drug. We have to set down the alcohol. Then we can begin working on the mental obsession that gets me to drink once I'm convinced that drinking is killing me. It's like I realize that if I jump off this cliff, I love the analogy in the big book after the farmer about the alcoholic jaywalker.
Oh
You,
yeah.
great story. Just keeps getting wondering why he gets injured and injured and injured. You know, and the reality is, stop using, stop drinking. That's the first step. You know, just realize you are powerless. Can you take one drink? Can you take one drug? Can you take one hit? Can you take one injection? Can you take one and be okay? If you can't, you probably have a problem. You need to stop drinking, stop using, uh, and sometimes detox is medically indicated. For a person to reduce or minimize their withdrawals, which will physiologically make them want to use in ways that the mental obsession isn't even coming into play here. We're talking about a physical dependency. We need to wean people off of that. But once we do that, we need to introduce them to another way of thinking that demands rigorous honesty.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I love that. I was gonna ask you too, how did you get into the sober coaching and the life coach? Could you just tell me just a little bit about how that came to play?
I I was a high school dropout. I dropped out of high school when I turned 18 on January 3rd of 1972. Uh, so going back to school, I'd got my GED a couple of years later. Then I went deeper into alcoholism. So going back to school was always something important to me, and I decided to go back to college when I was 39, and I got my degree. Uh, and I became a certified counselor, got my degree in alcohol and drug studies and human services. And I started on a path of just working in treatment centers, social model, medical models, lower court counseling, dual diagnosis, you name it. I've worked at DUIs. Um, and I realized that I was pretty good at this. I could write, I could articulate. I'm a public speaker. I'd done a lot of that evangelical speaking, and I realized I really had a gift for it, and and I just have a way uh, of never forgetting where I came from. And people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And I realized that I could touch people, that people could see me as real, and it just developed. And and I think when I did a lot of speaking, you know, 20, 25 years sober, and people were starting to ask me, come here, come there. And so I started doing that. And then when things really turned around 8.5 years ago, when I was 30 years sober, I thought, okay, now you need to accelerate this. Now you really need to get back, because I felt a real sense of obligation to recovery and to the people who would come after me, and building a legacy and being remembered as a person who gave. And so I developed my website. I started doing videos and podcasting, and I started learning about the web, social media, and people started reaching out to me and said, "Would you coach me here? Would you coach me there?" Now, mind you, I never coach anyone that I meet in the rooms of AA. Never, because I'm a sponsor. I don't make any money off of AA, nothing like that at all. But I speak for organizations and places I won't name that actually pay me to go and do things, or I'll coach a marriage in relationship coaching, or I'll coach someone with a different addiction and just help them you know get their mind right. And so recovery is recovery. But I want your listeners to know I don't make a dime off of anything. Everything I ever produce, whether it's YouTube or my podcast channel, just like you, Drew, my website, I pay for all of that myself out of my pocket. And anytime anyone wants any access to me or to my content, it's always free. I would never charge anyone who were in the rooms.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I think that's super cool. And so where can people find you if they needed help and they really wanted to reach some of your services? How would they do that?
Well, my phone number is 801 995 2753. So anyone can always message me and I'll always get back to them. 801 995 2753. On YouTube, I'm Real Recovery Guy, REAL RECOVERYGUY. There you can find, I have 32 videos and all my podcasts are there. Obviously, podcast channels, they can find Recovery Guy Podcast. And then my website is where my blogs are at as well, recoveryguy.org. So there's a number of ways to reach me. Um, you know, the and one thing I'm really interested in, it says what we can do each day for the man who's still sick. The answers will come if your own house is in order, but obviously you cannot transmit something you haven't got. See to that your relationship with him is right. And that's what I do every day, Drew. I do step 10. I take my inventory. When I'm wrong, I promptly admit it. Then step 11, I sought through prayer and meditation to improve that conscious contact with God as we understood God, praying only for the knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. Then I acknowledge that spiritual awakening in step 12. I tried to carry the message to alcoholics and to practice the principles in all my affairs. And that's how I live my life. Sometimes I live it better than other days. I'm human. I'm recovered, but I'm human, and I have my frailties and my ups and downs, just like anyone else. I never stop being human. I'm just recovered human, and so what I can do every day for someone. Obviously, you found me on social media. I'm pretty out there in more ways than one, but I'm pretty reachable, and I will entertain anyone, just like you will. I mean, gosh, I message you and you get right back to me, and that's what we do. Because you and I, we understand the obligation and the responsibility that we play in the roles of the newcomer, and to not be available for someone else's recovery would be to deny my own recovery. My God only fills my empty cup. He never fills a cup that's half full.
Yeah, and I love that. Thank you so much, Robert. I've taken up almost an hour of your time. I'm going to ask you one more question. What's your message to those that are out there suffering? Maybe haven't tried AA, have never had a recovery program, are realizing that, you know what, my relationship with alcohol is not quite normal. What is your message to them?
Just join us. You know, there's no judgment. There's no we're better than anyone else, because at the end of the day, we're just a bunch of sick people trying to get well. And if we can do anything for you, we just want you to come and join us. On page 17, Drew, The first page of There's a Solution. It talks about the friendliness. There's an understanding, a camaraderie, a joyousness. It says it pervades the vessel from steerage to captain's table. And that's what we're so fellowship starved. We're so lonely. Hey, if you're lonely, come and join us. If you're in despair, come and join us. If you want a reasonably good cup of coffee, come and join us. It doesn't matter. You know, if you don't want to die, come and join us. What do you got to lose? I mean, is life going to get any better doing what you're doing? Or is life going to get better when you do what Drew and I and others like us do? So we'll love you even after you learn how to love yourself, but don't die from a treatable condition.
Yes. Thank you so much, Robert. I really appreciate your time. I'm super excited to have you coming on here, and I loved all the stuff you had to say. You know, I learned a lot from it. I hope other people do as well. Just want to say thank you, man. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for your journey, and I'm glad that you and I are friends, and I look forward to that friendship growing.
Me too. Me as well, man. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. You made it through another episode. Thanks again, and if you'd like to collaborate or come on the show, please email me at thesoberfixpodcast@gmail.com. Have a great day.